Welcome to Great in the Sack, when misogyny leads to mayhem. With me, your host, Nicole Davenport. "They butchered you," the doctor said flatly. Elaine blinked. "Excuse me?" The doctor repeated herself. "They butchered you. You've been sterilized." For a moment, everything around her screeched to a halt, her eyes fixed on a spot on the wall as the words set in, foreign but somehow familiar. She was 19, married, and trying to start a family, but failing. She always seemed to be ill, and bleeding irregularly. The doctor's words bounced around in her head. It was starting to come together, starting to make sense. She had been 14 when it happened. Just 14. And no one had told her. Just 6 years earlier, when Elaine was 13, she, along with one of her sisters, were placed in her grandmother's already overcrowded home. The reason for this was because her mother had become incarcerated, and her father was seen as an unfit parent. She was one of 8 children. The other 6 siblings went to foster homes. Unfortunately, both of Elaine's parents struggled with alcohol and were neglectful. After moving into her grandmother's home, she became a victim and survivor of repeated assaults. These assaults came at the hands of a 20-year-old man with an extensive criminal record who lived in the neighborhood. The man threatened to kill her if she told anyone. Elaine's grandmother had received a social worker contact for facilitating her and her sister's move into the home. When Elaine began to show, the social worker noticed, and it was revealed that Elaine had been assaulted. This social worker then did something almost unimaginable to us now. Now, I said almost. This social worker drew up a petition stating that Elaine was, quote, feeble-minded, end quote, and basically got herself assaulted, and that her feeble-mindedness would lead to further promiscuity down the line, and also the inability to care for future children. It was a petition for sterilization and was presented to the North Carolina Eugenics Board. So when Elaine gave birth to her son at the age of 14, the state of North Carolina stepped in, not to offer help or anything like that, but to deliver an order for sterilization authorized by the Eugenics Board. Now, they just needed signatures from Elaine's family members. Even though her father had lost custody over his children, he was still allowed to sign for consent. Her grandmother signed as well, having little literacy and no idea as to what she was signing. She was also being threatened to be taken off of government assistance if she did not sign. So she consented on the form by signing an X. An irreversible tubal ligation was performed during her C-section. Elaine woke up after a whole week, medical staff revealing that she'd been in a coma. That seemed pretty strange to Elaine at the time, even at 14 years old, which is when she gave birth. But now it all made so much sense. She later said that she had been assaulted twice, by the perpetrator and then by the state. Now you may be thinking, this must have been a long time ago, but when this happened to Elaine Riddick, it was March 5th, 1968. America's sterilization movement was part of a broader national campaign to eliminate traits and populations that were considered undesirable. This included efforts to prevent race mixing and to limit immigration from groups viewed as racially or culturally inferior, particularly Eastern Europeans, Jews, Italians, and blacks. Beginning with Indiana in 1907, a total of 32 states enacted laws that permitted the involuntary sterilization of individuals deemed unfit to reproduce. The last of these specific laws remained in effect until 1979, with their reach extending over 7 decades. The targeted included individuals labeled as criminals, juvenile delinquents, women accused of sexual deviance, homosexual men, welfare recipients, and people diagnosed with mental illness or epilepsy. In many states, African Americans and Hispanic Americans were disproportionately subjected to these procedures. As Professor Paul Lombardo noted, the underlying sentiment behind such policies often came down to deeply racialized and classist assumptions. Quote, "The fewer black babies we have, the better," end quote, is what some claimed, rationalizing their actions by suggesting those children would just end up on welfare. But even now, in the year of our Lord 2025, recent reports show that 31 states and the District of Columbia have laws that allow for the forced sterilization of individuals with disabilities, often under court order or through guardianship arrangements. This issue was partially reintroduced thanks to Britney Spears' conservatorship, throughout which she was forced to take birth control. 17 states permit the sterilization of minors with disabilities. Only a few states, such as North Carolina and Alaska, have explicit prohibitions against forced sterilization of individuals under guardianship, probably due to their brutal history with eugenics. And speaking of North Carolina's eugenics program, one of the most aggressive in the nation, it is important to confront the fact that it served as a model for Nazi Germany's own eugenics policies in the years leading up to the Holocaust. This episode of Great in the Sack, When Misogyny Leads to Mayhem, is dedicated to all of those living at the margins. We proudly support Equal Justice Initiative, which is committed to ending mass incarceration and excessive punishment in the United States, confronting racial and economic injustice, and protecting human rights, especially for those most vulnerable and forgotten in American society. If you'd like to learn more or support their work, head to eji.org. Every voice matters. Content warning. This episode contains discussions of sexual violence and assault, medical abuse and forced sterilizations, historical and systematic racism including slavery and colonial violence, witchcraft accusations and their use in state-sanctioned violence, misogyny, gender-based violence, and the pathologization of women, ableism, and the eugenics movement. All of these terms are used intentionally, and I will no longer be euphemizing these terms, but instead will use respectful terms without sanitizing the violence, because that only serves the systems that silence survivors. Listener discretion is strongly advised. This content may be disturbing or re-traumatizing for some, so please take care while listening and skip any parts that feel too heavy. With all that being said, let's get started. Now, we left off last episode with King James' book being out there, influencing weirdos left, right, and center. His new improved Witchcraft Act gave witch hunters like Matthew Hopkins, the self-appointed witchfinder general, as you'll recall, the ideological fuel they needed to keep the witch panic going. Matthew Hopkins, who gave himself that dorky title, played a pivotal role in one of the most intense waves of witch hunting in England, particularly in East Anglia during the English Civil War. Though his official title was self-appointed, his influence was unfortunately quite real. Between 1644 and 1647, Hopkins and his associate, John Stern, were responsible for the investigations, trials, and executions of between 100 and 300 individuals, a significant portion of all witch trial victims in England's early modern period. Born around 1620, Hopkins was the son of a Puritan clergyman and likely trained in law, though he had no official legal standing. He emerged at a time when central authority had weakened due to the war, which allowed for local fears and religious extremism to shape judicial actions. Communities, destabilized by conflict, were especially vulnerable to panic over perceived witchcraft, which was increasingly tied to both theological anxieties and local social tensions. Hopkins utilized a variety of harsh and often legally dubious interrogation methods, including extended sleep deprivation, which they called watching, the tried and true searching for devil's marks, and the swimming test, where accused persons were bound and submerged. Those who floated were considered guilty because the water hath rejected them. And, of course, those who sank were rarely saved in time from drowning. Torture was officially banned in England, but Hopkins operated in a legal gray area where such practices were tacitly tolerated or overlooked. He was not a volunteer in this role either, just to be clear. Towns and parishes paid him for his services, sometimes in substantial sums too, which may have created incentives to escalate accusations. While there is limited documentation of Hopkins directly profiting through confiscated property, the financial element of his work is well established and, to be honest, quite obvious. In 1647, shortly before his death, possibly from tuberculosis, though hopes were that he himself became executed as a witch, Hopkins published The Discovery of Witches, defending his actions and offering what reads today as both a procedural account and a justification of his role in the trials. The Witchfinder General's activities marked a turning point in English witch trials. I think it's fair to say that his extreme violence may have helped to finally break the spell over people obsessed with witches. After his death, public attitudes began to shift. His extremism became a cautionary tale, and skepticism concerning witch-hunting practices grew in both legal and theological circles. In the rest of the areas of present-day Europe and Scandinavia, however, the witch hunts persisted. In Ribe, Denmark, the 1641 case of Maren Splid stands out. Maren, a prosperous tailor's wife known for her sharp tongue, became the target of a rival's accusations. Despite initial acquittal, King Christian IV personally intervened, leading to her retrial and execution. The king's involvement underscored how personal vendettas could intertwine with state mechanisms, turning justice into a tool for settling scores. By the 1660s, a new wave of trials exploded in the northern German area, though it was the area of southern Germany that was previously affected. Back to Sweden, during a time of growing Protestantism, the regions of Mora and Älvdalen became epicenters of hysteria during the period known as Det stora oväsendet, which means the great noise. In Mora 1669, a commission interrogated 60 adults and numerous children over a 5-day period. The testimonies, primarily from children, spoke of abductions to the witches' sabbath called Blå Kula, flying on goats and pacts with the devil. These accounts led to the execution of 23 adults and 15 children. Notably, the trials in Älvdalen in 1668 marked the beginning of Sweden's witch hunt wave, resulting in multiple executions based on similar child testimonies. But by 1682, the tide finally began to turn. King Louis XIV of France prohibited further witchcraft trials in his country. That same year, Mary Trembles and Susanna Edwards were the last known women to be hanged for witchcraft in England. And just like that, the centuries of bloodshed began to sputter to a halt. Mainly because power structures evolved and persecuting witches was no longer politically useful. While Europe grappled with the decline of witch hunts, other parts of the world were experiencing their own shifts. In the American colonies, the infamous Salem witch trials loomed on the horizon. Deeply influenced by the old European fears and by manuals like Malleus and King James's version of the Bible, of course, the Puritans carried the witch-hunting spirit with them to the New World. The Salem witch trials of 1692 and 1693 were not the first American witch trials, but they would be the most infamous and arguably the most symbolically devastating. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a theocratic society rooted in Puritanism, which is a branch of Protestantism, but even more hardcore. The Puritans moved out to the New England area to escape religious persecution. Yes, this is the thing Americans always say, myself included in the past, when explaining that persecuting others for their religious or non-religious beliefs is dumb because, quote, people came here from England to escape that kind of judgment. Turns out, though, that the Puritans were on a level up towards fanatical. They disagreed with things about the way that the Church of England worked, and while both Puritanism and Protestantism both arise from Calvinism, the two religions are pretty different, mainly in the way that Puritans were opposed to the use of the Book of Common Prayer and kneeling to receive communion, amongst other things, all of which they believed constituted popery, which means basically heresy by supporting Catholic practices. King Charles I was not having any of that, which is actually why Puritans came to the Salem colonies at the time. Now, in my opinion, the events concerning what happened in Salem are kind of a horse of a different color. Prior to the Salem witch trials of 1692 and 93, Salem Village, which is modern-day Danvers, Massachusetts, was characterized by deep social fragmentation, pervasive mistrust, and prolonged community discord. The population was widely regarded as quarrelsome, with persistent disputes over property boundaries, grazing rights, and church governance. These conflicts were exacerbated by the village's tense and often adversarial relationship with nearby Salem town, further contributing to a climate of unrest. Religious leadership became a central point of contention. Despite receiving official backing from the Massachusetts General Court, the village's early ministers, James Bailey and George Burroughs, departed under strained circumstances, largely due to the congregation's failure to uphold their financial obligations. Burroughs, notably, was later executed for witchcraft during the 1692 hysteria. His successor, Deodat Lawson, also left after failing to secure formal ordination, highlighting continued instability in church leadership. The selection of Samuel Parris as the village's first ordained minister marked a turning point. Although he was initially offered a standard salary and use of the parsonage, the subsequent decision to grant him full ownership of the property contradicted prior village resolutions, deepening existing divisions. Parris further alienated his parishioners by emphasizing moral scrutiny and imposing public penance for minor transgressions, which inflamed communal tensions rather than uniting the congregation. In this fractured and morally charged environment where religious, economic, and interpersonal conflicts remained unresolved, the groundwork was laid for the eruption of collective hysteria. As historian Marion Starkey suggests, such a volatile setting rendered a major societal rupture all but inevitable. The result was a community that would turn its suspicions inward on each other. To understand the moral force behind the Salem witch trials, one must look to Cotton Mather of Puritan New England. Mather was born in 1663. As he got older, he became deeply preoccupied with spiritual warfare. In 1689, he published Memorable Providences Relating to Witchcrafts and Possessions, a widely circulated account of demonic possession in Boston that helped lay the ideological groundwork for the Salem trials. Although he did not serve as a judge, Mather's writings legitimized the use of spectral evidence, which had long ago been outlawed in areas of Europe, and painted witches as existential threats to the moral fabric of the colony. Cotton Mather's father, Increase Mather, initially supported the witch trials and spoke positively about his son's writings with his full chest, but eventually grew increasingly concerned about the evidentiary standards. Either way, the accusations began in February 1692, when Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, the young daughter and niece of Reverend Samuel Paris, a known witch hunt enthusiast and slave owner, by the way, began experiencing fits and strange behavior. Side note, a neighbor of the Paris family, Mary Sibley, suggested using the folk remedy of a witch's cake to identify whether witchcraft was afflicting the girls. She instructed John Indian, an enslaved man in the Paris household, to make the cake, and Tituba, also enslaved by the Paris family, baked it. The cake was made from rye flour and the urine of the afflicted girls. It was then fed to a dog, under the belief that this would reveal the witch responsible for the afflictions. Spoiler, it did not. This act was considered a form of counter-magic and was frowned upon by the Puritan community. Reverend Samuel Paris, upon discovering the use of the witch cake, reprimanded Mary Sibley for her actions, viewing them as a grand error. Following the incident, the afflicted girls, including Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, accused Tituba of witchcraft. Under pressure and after being beaten by Reverend Paris, Tituba confessed to practicing witchcraft and claimed that there were other witches acting alongside her. Her confession played a significant role in fueling the hysteria that led to the Salem witch trials. Anyway, when the girls were pressured for explanation, they accused local women of witchcraft also. 2 other girls became afflicted and began throwing accusations left and right. The contagion of blame and intergenerational resentment spread quickly like a hot trend. Soon, over 200 individuals were accused. 19 people were hanged, including Tituba, and one, Giles Corey, who was pressed to death with stones after refusing to enter a plea. Corey's case is among the most grotesque examples of the judicial cruelty embedded in these proceedings. Refusing to speak in court, perhaps knowing silence would prevent the state from confiscating his estate, Giles was laid beneath wooden boards to be slowly crushed with stones. As Giles lay there, the sheriff said, "Giles, you need only to speak the words. Confess or deny. Just give us the plea, and this ends." Giles' only response to the sheriff's demands was the defiant phrase, "More weight." His death was as much an indictment of the court's cruelty as it was a symbol of resistance, because to refuse to plea was unheard of before then. By October 1692, doubts had begun to show in the public facade of moral certainty. Massachusetts Governor William Phips, alarmed by the spread of accusations and the growing social disorder, dissolved the special court of Oyez and Termine, which had been formed specially for these trials, and forbade further arrests. Spectral evidence was finally discredited. The last executions occurred in September 1692, and the final trials wrapped up in early 1693, with many convictions overturned and survivors released. A year later, the General Court declared a day of fasting and soul-searching. In 1711, monetary restitution was offered to the families of some victims, but for many, the damage was beyond repair. In 1693, Increase Mather, father of Cotton Mather, if you recall, published Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits, which criticized the reliance on spectral evidence. As I said before, spectral evidence was long ago disregarded in the trials of Europe, around when evidence or proof was required for witch accusations, which was the basic dehumanization of women by checking for these so-called witch marks. Either way, this helped to bring an end to the executions. The Salem witch trials marked the final outbreak of witch hunting in the literal sense in the Western world. In their wake, the notion of the witch hunt began to evolve as a cultural metaphor, a language for understanding what happens when societies weaponize authority. We will also see, much later, the perverse, bastardized way in which the term witch hunt can be used. In the years that followed the Salem witch trials, there was what I like to call a sort of spiritual hangover, because eventually the people of Massachusetts had to look at themselves and ask, what have we done? And I can only imagine the answers weren't easy. Some judges, like Samuel Sewall, did publicly confess their guilt. Also, one of the primary accusers during the trials publicly confessed in 1706 that her accusations had been false. She was the only one of the accusers to do this. It was Ann Putnam Jr., at age 27, who stood before the Salem Village congregation as Reverend Joseph Green read her written confession. In it, she expressed deep remorse for her role in the trials, stating, quote, "I desire to be humbled before God for that sad and humbling providence that befell my father's family in the year about 92, that I, then being in my childhood, should by such a providence of God be made an instrument for the accusing of several persons of a grievous crime, whereby their lives were taken away from them, who now I have just the grounds and good reason to believe that they were innocent persons, and that it was a great delusion of Satan that deceived me in that sad time." End quote. The courts began reversing convictions, one by one. Some families received compensation, if you can even call it that. Money for the loss of a wife, a husband, or a child. While the witch hunting became less and less, though as I stressed in part 1, still ongoing in parts of the world today, different types of witch hunts, even more institutionalized, would soon begin. In part 1, I said that othering people isn't natural, that it's learned, and I stand by that. But it's also true that our brains are wired for survival. Humans throughout history have sought out safety, found patterns for survival, and protected the group because there was power and security in numbers. That is in our genes. But biology doesn't tell us who to fear. Culture does that job. And there's a phrase in evolutionary psychology that says, quote, "Genes hold culture on a leash." We discussed this concept in episode number 7 regarding evolutionary psychology and inceldom. It means that biology sets the stage, but culture directs the play. The instinct to defend ourselves might be ancient, but who we decide is dangerous, that's a story we're taught. So while we aren't born fearing our neighbors, we are born into a world that teaches us who to blame when things go wrong. Now, nearly a century later, around the late 1700s, the war against England was settling down across the 13 original colonies in America. Enlightenment ideals were filling Europe, but only for certain classes and races, keep in mind. The French Revolution was right around the corner. Thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau were dominating the intellectual scene. This is the so-called modern era that has the balls to call itself the Age of Enlightenment. I know, I can't use today's logic for the vibes of yester-century. It's just that all that enlightenment did nothing to stop, for example, the Atlantic slave trade, which was in full swing. The othering of slave trading wasn't always centered around ideas of racial superiority. In ancient Greece, the term barbaros, which we get the word barbarian, originally referred to anyone who did not speak Greek. The name came from the Greeks' perception that foreign languages sounded like bar bar bar, a kind of gibberish or unintelligible noise, hence barbaros. Importantly, this distinction was not based on race as we think of it today. The Greeks didn't categorize or other people by skin color or physical features, but by language, customs, dress, and political organization. Greeks saw themselves as culturally and intellectually superior, associating outsiders with disorder, despotism, or irrationality, especially those from Persia or Eastern empires. So, in that sense, the term barbarian was about being foreign or culturally other, not racially inferior. It was a marker or cultural difference, not biological hierarchy. Basically, anyone who wasn't Greek was seen as inferior, but they could become Greek by behaving, dressing, and speaking like Greeks. This did not save non-Greeks from slavery, however. It is fair to say, though, that Greeks enslaved other Greeks too, so being Greek did not guarantee freedom either. Entire Greek cities could be conquered and the inhabitants enslaved. So while there was a cultural divide between Greeks and non-Greeks, slavery was more of a function of power and domination rather than a strictly ethnic or racial institution, as it would become later. By the time that the trans-Saharan and Arab slave trades from the 7th century onward, there was a change in the way slave trading began to look, literally. This particular slave trade lasted over 1,300 years, and though not based purely on race, it did reinforce anti-Black ideologies in many parts of the Islamic world. Enslaved women were often used for concubinage, while men were castrated and used in military or domestic service. The transatlantic slave trade occurred from the mid-16th century to the 1860s and exemplified when slavery really became systematically racialized, though it had been heading in that direction for some time. Blackness itself became associated with slavery. Between 12 to 15 million Africans were taken across the Atlantic, though many more died during capture or transport. Equal Justice Initiative states that, quote, the abduction, abuse, and enslavement of Africans by Europeans for nearly 5 centuries dramatically altered the global landscape and created a legacy of suffering and bigotry that can still be seen today, end quote. Now, you may be asking, how does slave trading relate with witch hunts? Well, they both have similar elements to them. Just as European witch hunts disproportionately targeted women who were poor, unmarried, outspoken, or simply inconvenient to the social order, the enslavement of people of West Africa often began with the vulnerable, war captives, orphans, widows, people accused of crimes or disruptive behaviors, or even outsiders from marginalized ethnic groups. Often, people were branded as criminals or enemies with flimsy justification, in some cases not unlike how women were branded witches. As the demand for slaves rose due to European influence, inter-African conflict intensified, and enslaving others became a way to protect your own, or to appease colonial powers and preserve social order. Both witch hunts and the transatlantic slave trade normalized cruelty. Within the witch hunts, public trials, torture, and executions were justified as moral and necessary. In the slave trade, the dehumanization of captives was rationalized as an economic or even spiritual duty. There was also a particularly brutal gendered aspect to the transatlantic slave trade. Female captives were often sexually exploited, both during capture and in transit. Women were sometimes preferred in slave markets for domestic or reproductive labor, echoing the control over female bodies seen in witch trials. Like witch accusations, enslaving others could be used to consolidate local power. Leaders or rivals could accuse others of wrongdoing and sell them into slavery, just as accusations of witchcraft often removed political or social threats. And guess what? I bet you've already guessed. In colonial Africa, witchcraft accusations and the transatlantic slave trade were deeply intertwined, both reflecting and reinforcing complex social dynamics. European colonizers often misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented African beliefs about witchcraft, leading to inconsistent policies that criminalized both witchcraft practices and accusations. In many African societies, individuals accused of witchcraft were often marginalized or enslaved. Accusations could serve as a means to justify the enslavement of certain individuals, particularly during times of social stress or economic hardship. This practice was not uniform across the continent, but was present in various regions where the slave trade was active. Some African communities even viewed Europeans as malevolent figures associated with witchcraft or even cannibalism, feasting upon the bodies of the Africans they had stolen away. These perceptions were fueled by the brutal realities of the slave trade and the mysterious fates of those taken away. In certain areas, Europeans were believed to be witches or to engage, as I said before, in cannibalistic practices. This reflects deep-seated fears and attempts to make sense of the traumatic experiences associated with colonial encounters. European colonial administrations implemented laws to suppress what they considered superstitious practices, including witchcraft. However, these policies were often inconsistent and failed to account for the cultural significance of such beliefs. In some cases, colonial authorities criminalized both the practice of witchcraft and the act of accusing someone of being a witch, leading to confusion and further marginalization of affected individuals. The intersection of witchcraft accusations and the slave trade in colonial Africa illustrates the complex ways in which social, cultural, and political factors intertwined. European colonial practices and policies often exacerbated existing tensions and misunderstandings surrounding witchcraft from the African's point of view, leading to lasting impacts on African societies. Christian missions introduced new spiritual paradigms, often reinterpreting local beliefs through a Euro-Christian lens that cast African traditions as demonic or irrational. Sound familiar now? Meanwhile, the penetration of capitalist markets intensified social stratification, and success or misfortune within these new hierarchies was often interpreted through a supernatural framework, which further reinforced witchcraft accusations. Colonial officials and missionaries analogized African witchcraft beliefs to pre-Enlightenment European traditions, assuming that exposure to Christianity and Western medicine would naturally lead to the disappearance of these beliefs. But they were wrong. By the mid-20th century, beliefs in witchcraft, far from disappearing, had acquired even more potent political meaning. Though nationalist leaders of Africa seldom spoke of it openly, it was true that the anti-witchcraft ideologies of Africans led to broader anti-colonial resistance. Movements like the Mau Mau revolt in Kenya incorporated cleansing rituals and rural uprisings in apartheid South Africa, and that reflected both political grievance and spiritual unrest. Thus, witchcraft beliefs and anti-witchcraft movements became embedded within the broader struggle against colonial rule, symbolizing a powerful critique of imperial illegitimacy. And so the label witch lived on, not necessarily because people believed in magic, but because some needed to try to control their own situations, while the rest needed a reason to feel justified in controlling the other. As we discussed in Part 1, this systematic othering of people doesn't go away. It mutates and readapts wherever and whenever it can, like cancer cells. The architects of witch hunts, scapegoating, and straight-up othering of all kinds, well, they love to travel, to learn new languages, to throw on a lab coat even, and they love crossing oceans to spread this patriarchal disease. And speaking of crossing oceans, let's cross over into other systems that weaponize fear through scapegoating. And just so you all know, I will be doing this part somewhat according to the timeline of history, but also expanding on certain areas that I feel are important to understand how this whole system of socio-political scapegoating works. Now, back as the 19th century progressed, medical institutions increasingly asserted authority over the bodies of women. This growing medicalization often intersected with social ideologies about gender, race, and class, particularly in the American South, where pseudoscience was used to rationalize both sexism and slavery. One of the most infamous and controversial figures from this era is Dr. J. Marion Sims, a man long praised as the father of modern gynecology, and is also the inventor of the speculum. Yeah, thanks a lot for that. Sims developed groundbreaking surgical techniques for repairing vesicovaginal fistulas, a condition resulting from traumatic childbirth. But the context in which his innovations were achieved reveals the violence inherent in medical progress during this period, which is around the mid-1800s. Sims conducted repeated experimental surgeries on at least 11 enslaved black women, including women named Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, without the use of anesthesia. His rationale was based on the racist belief, commonly held among physicians at the time, that black people, particularly black women, experienced less pain than white patients. These women could not consent. They were not regarded as full human beings under the law, but rather as property, vessels of labor and reproduction. Think about that huge power imbalance. The institutionalization of this kind of violence reflected broader stereotypes used to justify the exploitation of black women's bodies. One of the most enduring was the Jezebel stereotype, a hypersexualized, morally unrestrained caricature used to both demonize and excuse the sexual abuse of enslaved women by white men. This narrative was instrumental in denying black women victimhood and bodily autonomy. It paved the way for a racialized reproductive surveillance that continues in various forms today. Dr. Sims' legacy is a case study in the double bind women of color face in medicine. Seen as indispensable subjects for experimentation, yet simultaneously disqualified from care, empathy, and consent, not to mention pain medication. While Sims would go on to treat wealthy white women in more humane settings, the techniques that earned him fame were perfected through non-consensual procedures on women who had no voice, no agency, and no choice. These early gynecological practices are not outliers in the history of medicine either. They form a critical link in a broader pattern: the use of medical authority to pathologize, discipline, and control the bodies of those deemed as other, whether by gender, race, or class. Understanding this history is essential. It challenges us to confront how the foundations of modern science were often built not in sterile laboratories or academic halls, but on the backs of the enslaved, the poor, and the silenced. Now, while witch hunts tried to burn the independence out of women, it will become increasingly obvious that the 19th century tried to medicate it away. The Enlightenment gave way to the Industrial Age, but for women, progress often looked like new ways to pathologize our existence. Hysteria, from the Greek word hystera, meaning womb, became the diagnosis for almost anything that made a woman inconvenient. Melancholy, defiance, too much desire, not enough desire, or simply too much thinking. The idea wasn't new. Plato believed the womb could become restless and travel through the body, basically hitchhiking its way up toward the lungs and quite possibly suffocating a woman from within. That belief, as absurd as it sounds now, echoed across centuries, quietly justifying women's exclusion from power, property ownership, and autonomy. In earlier days, women suffering from so-called hysteria might have turned to midwives who treated pelvic distress through massage, a practice considered therapeutic, not sexual. But as medicine became professionalized and, of course, male-dominated, midwives were pushed out and male doctors took over. Suddenly, the same procedure was cloaked in clinical detachment, even as it could require repeated genital stimulation to, quote, relieve a woman of her hysteria. It's not just the act that's disturbing, it's the way women were treated as problems in need of fixing, not as patients. By the late 19th century, hysteria had become a spectacle, quite literally. In Paris, neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot held public demonstrations at the Salpêtrière hospital, excuse me if I butchered that, where hysterical women were displayed in lecture halls like scientific exhibits. Under hypnosis, they'd twitch, moan, or collapse, and Charcot would lecture about their nervous dysfunctions to a room full of men. These women, many of whom were institutionalized against their will, became like stage props of early neurology. One of Charcot's students was the Sigmund Freud. Freud would later redefine hysteria, shifting it from the body to the mind, introducing ideas of repression and trauma. But while Freud's theories cooked psychology up, they also kept the lens pointed inward. The question was never, what has been done to her, but instead, what is wrong with her? Because let's face it, that first question would have been considered somewhat radical for the time. So by the turn of the 20th century, the message was clear. If a woman was difficult because she was overwhelmed, frustrated by her circumstances, or just plain speaking up for herself, it wasn't society that needed to adapt. To finally begin valuing the women and all of their unpaid labor done in the home. No. It was her that should adapt. Stop being so emotional. Try smiling more. I bet women walked around with huge smiles plastered to their faces. I mean, imagine the fear of being accused of being hysterical, knowing the events that could follow. This belief in hysteria led to what became known as the rest cure. Developed by American physician Silas Vere Mitchell, the treatment involved isolating women in darkened rooms, forbidding them from reading, writing, or talking too much. Basically anything that might stimulate the mind in any way. The rest cure meant basically institutionalization. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a writer and early feminist, underwent the rest cure herself. Remember that season of American Horror Story, Asylum? That was inspired by this woman. She later wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, a haunting story about a woman descending into madness under this so-called treatment. It wasn't fiction so much as it was her own testimony. Gilman's story remains one of the most searing indictments of the medical control over women ever put to paper. Throughout the 1800s and even into the early 1900s, being institutionalized didn't necessarily mean you were violent or unstable. It could mean, as pointed out earlier, that you were inconvenient to a husband, a father, or to a society obsessed with order. Women were locked away for postpartum depression, for being too talkative, or for refusing marriage, or even for reading too much. Once inside, they became ghost stories, rarely heard from ever again, their legal status stripped. The medicalization of women's emotions during this time wasn't just some whoopsie in science, but seemingly more like a deliberate tool of social control. And 19th century England had already accepted the challenge of committing women for nonconformity. I mean, it obviously wasn't too difficult for them to create yet another act against a different yet same other, since they'd had so much experience in doing just that in the centuries before. The Lunacy Act of 1845 allowed for asylums to expand rapidly, transforming mental illness into a state concern. In the United States, The case of Elizabeth Packard in the 1860s is chillingly emblematic. She was institutionalized by her husband for disagreeing with his religious beliefs. It took years for her to be released, and when she was, she became a fierce advocate for the rights of married women and those wrongfully confined to asylums. And even well into the 20th century, control by use of medicine continued to ruin lives, sometimes even behind the closed doors of America's most powerful families. Rosemary Kennedy, sister to President John F. Kennedy and Senator Robert F. Kennedy, was subjected to a lobotomy in 1941 at just 23 years old. She was considered too moody, too disobedient, and much too curious about sex. So for the Kennedys, Rosemary was just too extra. And that was just too inconvenient. In a family obsessed with control and image, she was seen as a liability. In my opinion, this isn't far off from so-called honor-based violence. The operation, arranged by her father, without her consent, of course, left her with the cognitive function of a 2-year-old. She spent the rest of her life institutionalized, hidden from the public, even from many of her own siblings. Hospitals and asylums, often overcrowded, unsanitary, and cruel, became warehouses for so-called deviant people. Women, people with disabilities, neurodivergent individuals, LGBTQ+ folks, basically anyone who didn't fit the mold was pathologized. Institutionalization was not seen as some kind of cure, though, make no mistake about that. It was containment. And much like the witch hunts that came before, it was about control. Control over bodies, behavior, and the boundaries of what society deemed acceptable. If a lobotomy was the answer to the question of non-conforming women, then eugenics, the science of genetic breeding, would gladly validate that answer. Now, have you ever heard the phrase, "nits make lice"? Well, the expression has been employed historically to justify the extermination of entire populations, including children, by equating them to parasites. The term nit refers to the egg of a louse, or lice, as suggesting that even the youngest individuals of a targeted group are future threats that must be eliminated. The most documented use of the phrase was by Colonel John M. Shivington during the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, where he led a surprise attack on a Cheyenne and Arapaho village, resulting in the deaths of approximately 150 Native Americans, predominantly women and children. After receiving pushback from some of his soldiers upon being given the orders to slaughter these natives, Shivington reportedly said, quote, "Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. Kill and scalp all, big and little. Nits make lice," end quote, implying that even children should be killed to prevent future resistance or other perceived problems. Some scholars draw parallels between Shivington's rhetoric and earlier colonial attitudes, such as those during the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland. While there is no direct evidence that the exact phrase was used during this period, the underlying ideology of eliminating future threats by targeting children was present. For instance, during the massacre at Drogheda, Oliver Cromwell's forces killed many civilians, including women and children, under the belief that this would prevent future rebellion. Eugenics is defined as the science of genetic breeding. And while I understand many of you have heard of eugenics who are listening, there are nuances that I have learned in my research that I had no idea about. So buckle up. Here comes a crash course on eugenics. Imagine how scientific that word sounded, eugenics, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Maybe even neutral, sterile even, but in reality, it was rooted in pseudoscience and drenched in white supremacy. It was never about science. It was about control. Who gets to live and who gets to reproduce. Eugenics functioned much like the witchcraft statutes of earlier centuries. seeking to cleanse a society of elements deemed impure, undesirable, or threatening. But instead of burning women at the stake, modern governments used surgical procedures, laws, and institutions to enforce reproductive control. Both targeted those on the margins, and both used fear and stigma as justification. These weren't isolated to dictatorships either, and many do not realize how many civilized nations were engaging in eugenics. But I'm about to fill you in, and it's wild. Public health and medicine were weaponized in pursuit of social conformity, and women, especially those institutionalized or racialized, often bore the brunt of it. At this point, I should say that there is what's called positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics is still used even today. Think about selective IVF and the screening of embryos for genetic mutations. I think most people have an idea of what negative eugenics is. It basically aims to reduce reproduction among people with traits seen as undesirable, often through forced sterilization, marriage restrictions, or even genocide. Now, Charles Darwin published Origin of Species in 1859. By the time Darwin published this work, a dude named Herbert Spencer had been trying to apply evolutionary logic to human society already. In 1864, Spencer coined the term survival of the fittest in reference to humans, which I always thought was something Darwin had coined regarding biology. This type of rhetoric concerning the application of evolutionary logic to human competition and social policy became known as social Darwinism. This so-called scientific movement was fathered by British explorer Francis Galton, who was actually a cousin to Charles Darwin. He coined the term eugenics in 1883. Galton took his cousin's ideas about evolution and twisted them into a theory of superiority. If we can breed animals for strength or intelligence, he thought, why not people? I think that it is important to say here that Charles Darwin was pretty unhappy about his research and theories about natural selection being used to prop up this ugly supremacist ideology of what is referred to as social Darwinism. He never meant for his ideas to go outside of a biological context into a cultural context because they are completely different contexts and were not at all pervasive to one another. Either way, Galton planted the seed. But it was in America that the seed grew into a forest. At the epicenter of global eugenics was a U.S. facility nestled on the shores of Long Island. Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory is its name. It was there, under the direction of the very classist and very racist biologist Charles Davenport, no relation, thank you very much, that the Eugenics Record Office, the ERO, was founded in 1910. Davenport was a huge supporter of the idea of using positive eugenics on the wealthy and negative eugenics on those deemed lesser. That dude would have fit in great with some of the current administrations around the world. So the ERO collected family trees, medical records, criminal histories, and poverty reports, all to prove that traits like feeble-mindedness, promiscuity, poverty, and criminality were hereditary. Spoiler, they weren't. They aren't. From these files came legislation, forced sterilization laws passed in over 30 states, the first of which was enacted in Indiana in 1907. Doctors were authorized to sterilize thousands of Americans, often even without their knowledge. Most of them were women, which always strikes me as a WTF because a man can create many more children than a woman, much quicker. Many were poor. Many were Black, Latina, or Indigenous. Some were simply women who'd had too many children. Others were forced while being residents at institutions for hysteria, immorality, or being unfit mothers. In 1927, the United States Supreme Court handed down a disturbing decision in Buck v. Bell, upholding the constitutionality of Virginia's Sterilization Act of 1924. The plaintiff, Carrie Buck, was a young woman institutionalized at the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and the Feeble-Minded. Declared feeble-minded by the state, though by all credible accounts she was of average intelligence, Carrie had been placed in foster care where her foster parents' nephew assaulted her and she became pregnant. Rather than prosecuting the assault, the state used her pregnancy as evidence of moral and mental unfitness. Carrie's sterilization was carried out under the guise of protecting public welfare and controlling hereditary defects. Her case was orchestrated by eugenicists as a legal test designed to validate forced sterilization programs already underway across the United States. An infamous quote by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. about the case reads, quote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough," end quote, referring to Carrie's mother, herself, and her child born out of assault. The ruling class paved the way for the sterilization of over 60,000 people in the United States under similar laws, disproportionately affecting women, the poor, people of color, and those with disabilities. Buck versus Bell was never overturned. Carrie Buck's story exposes how pseudoscience, misogyny, and classism were codified into law under the banner of public health, transforming eugenics from theory into state-sanctioned violence. And it is also closely echoed by Elaine Riddick's case 41 years later, whom I spoke about in the beginning of this episode. In the broader sense, eugenics policies erupted all over the world through acts which are, again, in my opinion, reminiscent of the Witchcraft Acts. Germany followed suit to the U.S. in 1933, using American eugenics policy as a blueprint for the law for prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. As discussed in the beginning of the episode, the Nazis were particularly inspired by American eugenics laws. They even cited these laws within their own, which led to the forced sterilization of roughly 400,000 people and laid the ideological groundwork for the Nazis' genocide against the Jews. The Holocaust, in many ways, was an extension of state-led eugenic thinking taken to its extreme. But we now know that Germany was far from alone. Here's a small rundown of the different countries that were participating in eugenics, and I think you might be surprised. In Sweden, from 1935 to 1975, over 60,000 sterilizations were performed, targeting poor women, the disabled, and the Sami indigenous population. Canada's eugenic period went from 1928 all the way up to 1972 in Alberta. Sterilization laws were disproportionately used on Indigenous women and patients in their psychiatric hospitals. Japan's reign of eugenics was from 1948 to 1996, where more than 16,000 involuntary sterilizations were forced under the Eugenic Protection Law. Iceland, 1938, Denmark, 1929, Norway, 1934, and Finland, 1935. Each passed sterilization laws targeting people labeled as feeble-minded, mentally ill, or socially deviant. Mexico's state of Veracruz passed one of the earliest sterilization laws in Latin America in 1932. And China, a little bit late to the game in 1995, introduced reproductive laws that heavily regulated births based on disability status and genetic health policies widely seen as eugenic in nature. The thinking was that old go-to of imperialism and colonialism. If you can't eliminate the nits, at least stop them from reproducing. By 1939, 2 years before the gas chambers of Auschwitz began operating at full tilt, Nazi Germany had already begun testing the mechanics of mass murder on its own disabled population. Known as the euthanasia program, this initiative was not only an act of war, but an act of ideology. What began as a program targeting disabled children quickly escalated into the industrial-scale killing of institutionalized adults. Behind closed hospital doors and in care homes, tens of thousands of German citizens were labeled as Liebenschönwertes Leben, life unworthy of life. This was the calculated bureaucratic execution of a eugenic fantasy, a fantasy already mainstream in many Western nations, including the United States. What's really bonkers is the fact that doctors and nurses participated in this program. There are so few that resisted. Germany's medical establishment, trained to do no harm, by the way, folded almost entirely into the regime's racial logic. Physicians wrote evaluations from afar, approving patients for death based on forms listing their productivity, diagnosis, and economic burden, all in black and white. Nurses administered lethal doses of sedatives or withheld food and water. Entire facilities became murder factories, basically, masquerading as centers of care. This is what groupthink looks like. A textbook case, in fact. A highly educated population operating within closed institutions and under extreme ideological pressure began to confuse consensus with morality. The isolation of the medical profession, combined with the state propaganda and professional hierarchy, fostered a culture where questioning the plan meant questioning one's own patriotism, or risking one's livelihood, or even life. Even those who privately objected often said nothing. When everyone around you is participating in murder, silence begins to feel like professionalism. And it was in this silence that atrocity found efficiency. The moral collapse wasn't limited to Germany. It mirrored similar strains of thinking in the United States, where disabled people and poor women, especially women of color and indigenous women, were sterilized without consent in the name of public good. But Germany took it further, of course. It took the language of medicine and turned it into consent for genocide. It made bureaucracy its accomplice. The program, dubbed T4 after the address of its Berlin headquarters, Tiergartenstrafe 4, killed over 70,000 people in just under 2 years. After public resistance, most notably from Catholic Bishop Clemens August von Galen, Hitler ordered the official program to stop in August 1941. But that was only a shift in visibility. Killings resumed almost immediately in more decentralized, secretive forms. Overdoses, forced starvation, and covert injections, especially targeting bombing victims, displaced children, and the elderly. People who might not be missed, basically. And it didn't stop at Germany's borders either. Occupied Poland and Eastern Europe, disabled individuals and psychiatric patients were summarily executed by SS units or subjected to early gassing experiments, methods and personnel that would later be exported to the death camps of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. But this wasn't just about unfit bodies, let's be honest. It was also about controlling reproductive futures. Through a feminist lens, it's crucial to see how eugenics and euthanasia shared the same patriarchal root. The state deciding who may live, die, or reproduce. Nazi policy exalted Aryan women, but only so long as they could produce Aryan children. Women who did not fit that mold, disabled, Jewish, Romani, queer, foreign, were all rendered expendable. Many were sterilized. Others, especially in Eastern territories, were brutalized as spoils of war. Side note, it is funny how power works. In Nazi Germany, fascists were building this best-ever regime on racial hygiene and eugenic control, but at the same time, some of these fascists were peddling cheap Aryan supremacy ideology. They were also whispering the theories of the Madame Blavatsky. Yep, a woman. A mysticist, or witch even, behind closed doors. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky spiritualist and founder of Theosophy, had written theories of secret ancient wisdom and spiritual evolution, of root races and lost civilizations. Sounds like a drug-fueled dream, am I right? Either way, her mystical ideas, later warped by male occultists, were picked up by the Thule Society and others, feeding into early Nazi ideology. But basically, it seems as though the Nazis cherry-picked a couple of theories that suited their cause and ran with them. Blavatsky was a woman whose very existence defied patriarchal logic, as she became big enough and popular enough to be seen as a spiritual leader. But later, many of the things she wrote were found to be plagiarized, and these spiritually informed trips that she made over the world were pretty much completely fictitious. But between the First and Second World Wars, she was re-imaged by fascists as a prophet of white spiritual destiny due to the root race stuff. This, what some would call witch, would become like an oracle to some members of the Third Reich. So anyway, women who, once considered breeders of the Reich, were discarded as effective when their bodies or behaviors fell short. And as the Third Reich crumbled, these women, those who survived, did not return to any version of safety or normalcy. They became spoils of war by occupying forces, and once again, targets of a new kind of witch hunt, one could argue. As Nazi Germany collapsed and Allied forces swept through the country, a hidden chapter of history was unfolding. One that would remain buried in silence for generations. Hundreds of thousands of German women and girls were subjected to sexual violence by occupying soldiers, including those from the Western Allies. Shame, fear, and the political climate kept so many survivors silent. But the trauma endured, passed down through families, and etched into the lives of their children and grandchildren. These stories of weaponized sex and misogyny are a reminder that sexual violence has long been a weapon of war. And confronting these uncomfortable truths is essential to breaking the cycle. So, just to sum it all up for you here, while former Nazi scientists were welcomed into American and Soviet programs through Operation Paperclip, many of the women left behind, especially those who had relationships with occupying soldiers or were assaulted by advancing armies, were humiliated, shaved bald, and paraded in public or institutionalized, branded as traitors, collaborators, and or contaminated. It didn't matter that most had no agency anyway. That they had been used, coerced, or assaulted meant nothing. Their bodies became symbolic battlegrounds, repositories for national shame. It echoed the centuries-old rhythms of the witch hunts, not in the traditional sense of the name, but in form. The policing of women's sexuality, the moral panic around contamination, and the desire to cleanse the social fabric by purging the feminine other. These women were scrubbed from memory. This is groupthink too, when a society chooses redemption by scapegoating the powerless. T4 ended, and the Reich fell. But the scaffolding that allowed both to flourish, the pseudoscience, the scapegoating, and the control of women's bodies, did not collapse. It evolved again. And in the post-World Wars, it re-emerged under new fears and familiar names. Because when the power gets spooked, it always pops up somewhere else, maybe even with a few modifications, and doubles down on the ideology behind it, constantly rebranding and coming back into style. And this is where we'll pick back up from for part 3, which will include McCarthyism, the lavender scare, the crack baby myth and welfare queen trope, satanic panic, and present-day witch hunts, including the weaponization of the term cancel culture and aspects of the DEI backlash, not only in the US, but worldwide. Because, as you'll see, all of this ties together through the help of patriarchal systems such as nationalism, Christianity, and misogyny. What are your thoughts about part 2? I hope you will leave them in the comments along with any suggestions for topics to cover in the future. I apologize for how long it took to get this episode out, but I was very ill. I feel also that it's important to discuss these difficult subjects because history has a tendency of repeating itself. Thank you so much for listening. You can find me on all the socials, which are listed in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.